Well, I'm very pleased to introduce Eugene Gil Wanger, who is an attorney in Lansing, Michigan. Among his other very notable career accomplishments, Gil was a member of the Michigan State Constitutional Convention in 1961-62. And during that convention, he authored the provision in the Michigan Constitution which prohibits capital punishment in the state. Since about 1972, he's been the co-chair of the Michigan Committee Against the Death Penalty. He was awarded by the Michigan State Bar the Champion of Justice Award in 2005. In 2019, Gil was named Abolitionist of the Century by the organization The Journey of Hope. He is the author of a book called, let me get it here, Fighting the Death Penalty, a 50-year journey of argument and persuasion. He and his wife, Marilyn, have been very good friends of the National Death Penalty Archive in Albany, having donated two collections to the National Death Penalty Archive. One, the Henry Schwarzschild Memorial Collection, and the other, the Eugene and Marilyn Wanger Death Penalty Collection. So, Gil, thank you for being with us. Given your obvious lengthy interest and commitment to the death penalty as a policy, as a legal issue, what was it that got you interested in capital punishment from the outset?
As I think back, Jim, it was my very extensive experience in competitive interscholastic debate in high school and college that started me out because although capital punishment was not one of our debate topics, the experience gave me a great deal of appreciation and liking for reasoned argument. And then I got into law school after college at Michigan Law School and was very active in the moot court activities there and on the national level. And that kind of cemented my affection for that mode of thinking. In my senior year, I picked up a free copy of the October 1958 edition of the Journal of the American Judicature Society. And that was given free to the students. They put a big pile out there every time the magazine came out. And it was a highly respected organization, one of the very few, if not the only one in the country then dedicated to the improvement of the judicial and legal process. Well, in that journal, there was an article, a brief article about capital punishment, which included a list of 9 or 10 arguments, which I looked at and I found very persuasive. They arose, I believe, out of Delaware from a fellow named Herb Coben. And I thought, gee, that's interesting. I knew that Michigan had been without the death penalty for a long time, but it wasn't an issue in our state. And so I tore the article out and put it in my file of things that I'd want to look at later. Well, after graduating from law school, coming back to my hometown here in Lansing, the Michigan's capital city, 3 years later, I was an elected delegate to Michigan's Constitutional Convention, the fourth one they'd had, the first one in half a century. And as a delegate at the convention, I found myself very interested in presenting delegate proposals. Thinking back to the kind of proposals I might want to submit, I noticed that my political party, which was the majority party of the convention, 2/3 of the convention, was not very fast in filing delegate proposals, which are kind of like bills. And I noticed that The other party, the minority party, were filing delegate proposals like mad. In fact, there was one lady, very personable, who filed over 100 delegate proposals, and they all. She wasn't a lawyer, but a very nice person, very quiet. And so we thought, and her name was Daisy Elliott, and we asked her because some of these, all of them, really, they had the earmark of a legally trained mind. We asked her if she had some help in their proposal getting them together. And she very politely but firmly refused to answer that question. And so one of the delegates, or rather a wag up in front of me, penned and passed around the note, said, Daisy won't tell, but she will propose. And so with that background in mind, I decided to get going, and I filed 27 of them actually, and more than any other delegate of my party. And in doing so, I brought to bear our family friend of my folks and myself, Dr. Lemoyne Snyder, who was an expert, a recognized expert in legal medicine and the author of a homicide investigation book that had been nationally known for years and was very much against the death penalty, and who was a member of Earl Stanley Gardner's uh, Court of Last Resort. That was the only organization in the country that was dedicated to freeing innocent prisoners from prison. The only one. And it was Earl Stanley Gardner, the author of Perry Mason, tremendously famous uh, detective writer at that time. So Lemoyne Snyder was in that, and he influenced me pretty much. And so when I was looking through my file, after all, I had to do something to get a bunch of delegates in there on behalf of my political party, you see. I came across this article that I'd torn out in law school about the death penalty. And I thought to myself, Michigan has been without capital punishment now for 115 years. I think maybe it's time we put it in the Constitution. So that basically is how I got interested in that subject.
Well, that is fascinating. When you authored the specific provision and then introduced it at the convention, was it controversial? Was there opposition? Was it by acclamation? What happened?
Well, let me tell you the story. I submitted a proposal, the only one on the subject that was submitted in the convention. And I should say, during the campaign around the state to be elected for this, capital punishment was never suggested as a subject for constitutional treatment. So it was kind of a novel thought, and by a strange uh, quirk of procedure, that proposal came before the committee that I was a member of. It was meant for another committee, but somehow it got back to my committee. Well, so like delegates do with their proposals or in the legislature bills, they get some research together to show what are the reasons for it. And I did that, and then the committee agreed with me unanimously. And so then I wrote the committee report and even organized the floor debate. And it went out on the floor of the convention and was discussed, and it was passed with only 3 no votes. And that directly answers your question. Out of 144 elected delegates, only 3 of them voted no. So that's how the language no law shall be provided, and no law shall be enacted providing for the penalty of death got in Michigan's constitution. And I think from what I believe, it's still the case that Michigan is the only state constitution in America that has such a ban.
Wow, you don't find consensus of that nature about the death penalty almost anywhere these days. Has there been any serious effort in Michigan to repeal that provision or in any way question its place in the Constitution?
Yes, indeed. About 10 years after the Constitutional Convention was held, and of course the new Constitution was adopted, why, the battles begin because there had been a significant increase in the violent crime rate, and the public was becoming very frustrated and angry about it. And that led several legislators, for reasons best known to themselves, to propose that the Constitution be amended to repeal the ban on capital punishment so that they could get capital punishment in Michigan. So it was a real battle, and it went on for, well, frankly, it went on for over 30 years. There were two ways to do it. One was to have 2/3 of each house of our state legislature vote to put it on the ballot. And of course, we didn't want that. The other way was to have initiative petitions signed around the state up to a certain number of signatures. And if that was successful, that would get it on the ballot. And of course, we were very much against that. And my co-chair of the Michigan Committee Against Capital Punishment was he was a member of the other party. We were close friends, and he was quite prominent, in part because he was really an expert in election law. So we just got together and battled the thing out, not only in the legislature, where they never get the 2/3 vote in both houses, but 3 or 4 times in the courts against petition drives, which kept coming. And I tell you, that was a tremendous amount of work and excitement, because when you're in election law combats, the court will require you to file your appellate brief the next day.
Wow.
Or maybe even hours, and
Yeah.
these are important questions, and that's quite an exciting time. It indicates that you better know your subject pretty well.
Boy,
And
I'll say.
happily, I learned a lot, but happily my co-chair was a real expert on it. So we won. We had to go state court of appeals, Michigan Supreme Court, even federal court. But we won at every point. So it never got on the ballot, and it remains in the Constitution today.
Wow. Let me ask you one last question about the Michigan Constitution. When following that 1961-62 convention, with all of the proposals inserted, did it then have to go to the voters for final approval?
Yes,
And
the convention produced the document in final form, hopefully letter perfect, and then it was put on the ballot, and the public had to vote it up or down, and they adopted it. I might say there was a very vigorous campaign to get them to not adopt it, but that was defeated, and our side won. We had a recount. I remember I was in charge of the recount for our county, and there were, as one would expect, very, very few votes had to be changed.
well, your interest in the death penalty goes back a long way, but I know it's not confined to the legal arena. You've amassed an incredible library collection of materials related to the death penalty. When did you start that effort, and can you describe some of the materials that you managed to get your hands on and preserve?
Well, yes, I think so. At the Constitutional Convention, you remember, from a standpoint of the public opinion, the death penalty was not an issue, and it hadn't been since the 1930s in Michigan. So I asked, as most delegates did, the state library of Michigan, which was in Lansing, of course, big library, and they put their entire resources uh, at the beck and call of the Constitutional Convention. They even opened a branch library right in the building across the hall from our convention floor. So I asked him, what do you have on the death penalty? They only, as I recall, they only came up with 2 or 3 items, was all they had. One was the 1952 Annals of the American uh, Society of Political and Social Science, which was edited by the great Thorsten Saline at the University of Pennsylvania at the Wharton School. And then the other was Reference Shelf, that kind of semi-debate manual on many topics that is published periodically. I think by the H.W. Wilson Company. I think they're still in business, uh, uh, which contained a bunch of topical articles for and against the death penalty, all in one little rather small volume. I'm trying to think if there was anything else. I can't remember now if Arthur Kessler's famous book, Reflections on Hanging, was out in time for the convention, but it came out about that time. And I know it was called to my attention by Dr. Lemoyne Snyder, who I've already mentioned. Well, uh, so here we are. We've accomplished something in the convention, which everybody knew was important, but there was no big controversy or excitement about it because we had lots of important things that we had to do in the convention. This wasn't uh, by any means the only one. And I thought, I recall that shortly before that, my boss at the law firm told me that I was a natural born saver. You hate to throw anything away, he said. Well, uh, and I had been collecting in our local and state history since I'd been in high school. So I thought, there's a real need for information on this subject. So I started collecting. And when I was traveling around the country on vacations or wherever, uh, I'd stop at places like Goodspeed's in Boston, Scribner's in New York, and there was a fellow in Montclair, New Jersey named Patterson Smith, uh, all of whom were dealers in this sort of material, either Americana or capital punishment and criminal matters. And then, of course, there were booksellers' catalogs that came in. And I would say the internet came along just, you know, uh, uh, during that period. And that, of course, changed buying antiquarian books quite a little, but there are still outstanding sellers out there, and such as David Lesser, who specializes in Americana and occasionally gets something very good in on capital punishment, mainly 19th century. I have to say, going back to the convention, compared to today, there was virtually nothing in print on the subject of capital punishment anywhere in the country. It wasn't a hot topic. Publishers apparently didn't think that would sell. And about 5 years after the convention, Professor Hugo Beddoe came out with his groundbreaking book, The Death Penalty in America, which he published through several editions. And that was a terrific aid to all of us who were working with the issue. And it was the only thing. It was, you might say, the Bible of the those who are interested in capital punishment. It wasn't all against the death penalty, but Hugo was, and it was mostly centering on the arguments and the facts, which showed that the death penalty was a very bad idea. So that it got me going. And as the years went by, I kept building it up, and I fortunately found a computer program. Of course, these are in the DOS days. I don't think very many of the people watching were at all familiar with DOS, but if you are, you know that it was the first operating system for computers pretty much, and it was very robust. And as long as you didn't want to see any pictures, a lot could be accomplished. So I got a database, and as I acquired the books, I put them on the database with information about them and pamphlets and ephemera and so on. So I got going, and I don't know how many years ago now, but the booksellers, so they told me, they said, I think you've got the largest collection on capital punishment in private hands in America. Well, I thought, that's interesting. I'm surprised. Oh, well, it's an interesting subject. Why isn't somebody else collecting it? Well, I don't know. I never ran across someone in all my work who was making a point to collect capital punishment material. That doesn't mean they're not out there, of course. But so uh, I I got this collection together, and it contained not only the books and pamphlets and ephemera, but it also contained my massive files built up over the years on the subject, and quite a lot of recordings, mostly audio recordings, and graphics, especially a lot of posters on the subject, and even a big display of anti-death penalty campaign buttons, and several artifacts. And anyway, I was going along here just a few years ago, wondering what I should do with this collection. I knew it wasn't anything anybody would buy, but I thought it ought to be something that has some research value somewhere. And I got a call from an organization that I call the William S. Hine and Company up in New York, north of you. They run a service for libraries worldwide called Hine Online. And most libraries subscribe to Hine Online. And the fellows there, they said, well, we'd like to get your entire collection and digitize it for worldwide distribution, and mostly the libraries or other institutions. Uh, they do it for money, of course, and so not too many private individuals would subscribe. They'd go to the library for it, and so I thought, okay, I think I better find out more about these people. So I flew out to New York and went and visited them, had lunch with their president. And believe me, they run a fascinating operation with outstanding people. And so I thought, okay, we'll do that. And Jim, about that time, and I don't think there was any connection with the Hine people, but you got in touch with me. You had started the National Death Penalty Archives there at Albany at the State University of New York there, and you wondered if I'd be willing to contribute my collection to the archives. Well, I thought, that's very interesting. It's not in Michigan, but it's a national thing, and a lot of other stuff will be there. And I think that's a very good idea. And I started out by giving a collection of material in honor of my dear friend Henry Schwarzschild, who had passed away shortly before that. Henry was one of the three big, at that time, one of, I guess we'd call the big three death penalty abolitionists in the country. And today, we'd have to add Sister Helen to that, Sister Helen Prejean. But she was not as active as she has been since that time. So I donated that. And then the main collection, which was very large, decided, okay, we'll ship it to Hine, they'll digitize it, and then they'll ship it down to you. So that's the way it worked. It occupies 148 boxes, I think, and the archival size boxes, and a lot of flat storage for posters and things like that. And I did, as I said, I'd put all of this stuff on my computer. So based on that information and the fact that the database although it was back in from the DOS days, was uh, very powerful. I managed to, with a lot of extra work, produce an annotated bibliography of the whole collection with finding aids. And the Hind people published that, not only digitally, but they published it in hard copy. And I know you have a copy because I sent one to you and to some other folks. And so it's possible in using this collection or the Schwarzschild collection to uh, to find out where things are in the collection. If you just walk in like you do in most special collections, they say, "Sure, we have a big collection of this subject and that's public." I say, "Yes, well, would you give me a list of the items, a bib of it?" "Oh, well, we don't. We can't do that. We're still waiting to find a graduate student who will work cheap to do it, because when budget cutting time comes around at the colleges and universities, it seems like the library is always the first thing to get cut, and which is a great shame because, after all, the only two assets of a university or a college that are of any value really are the faculty and the library. All the rest is just window dressing, as far as I'm concerned. And so I thought, if I'd had just given this stuff and let them sort it out, they wouldn't have had the library there at SUNY like other libraries. They wouldn't have been able to get anybody to do the bibliography and the finding aids probably for quite a while. They have to find somebody who needs that work for not too much pay and somebody who's qualified. And also, it would be virtually impossible for them to get somebody who knew the field. And of course, I know the field, the literature of the death penalty, uh, or at least I did up before I gave you the collection and kind of slowed down on collecting this material. Although I do have another box just across the room here of material that I've got to process and send on to you guys.
Wow. Well, let me get your thoughts about one final subject. I know that you've been a proponent of encouraging individuals to come to the National Death Penalty Archive and make serious work of scholarly work of some of the collections in there. The Death Penalty Archive, of course, is open to the public, scholars, researchers. We do encourage people to come use it. And I have a copy of the bibliography you mentioned. It must weigh about 8 or 10 pounds. It's as big as the old traditional telephone book. So I know you can't begin to isolate a lot of what's in your collections, but what would be available, for example, of interest to a researcher or the public that they might find if they did pay a visit there and started to thumb through some of those materials?
Well, in the files section, which there are hundreds of files containing, of course, thousands of items, they would find the entire history of Michigan's experience with the death penalty. Then, in terms of the battles that went on in Michigan and elsewhere, because I was very active in the National Association to Abolish the Death Penalty too for many years, uh, they're all of the issues: the conviction of the innocent, the whether or not the death penalty deterred murder, the racial discrimination and the death penalty, uh, a number. In fact, there are about a dozen strong arguments, and I have files on all of them and books and pamphlets on almost all of them, and they can find those books and pamphlets in the collection. They go back to the 19th century, a few to the 18th century, but mostly 19th century, and of course, early 20th century. And you can find the development of this right along. And you can find a great deal of the scientific material that was published in original form, like Ehrlich's papers, which purported to show using econometric analysis that the death penalty did deter. which created a tremendous stir when it came out. Well, I got all the original publications that have it so that someone who wants to know the history of that and how we handled it in Michigan is, you know, that's just one of the things they can find out by looking at the collections. The other issues too. Well, not only that, there's a whole collection of death penalty cartoons. Now, that may seem rather uh, just strange and offbeat to a lot of people, but I tell you, when you're working with this subject for years, you do almost by necessity you develop uh, a, a sense of gallows humor, so that something that would appear to be not humorous at all to most people strikes you as being very funny. And I don't know why that's the case, but it does help keep you sane.
Well, Gil, thank you for all that you've done. The gift that you've given to this generation and future generations who will be interested in the death penalty and how it's evolved over time is just priceless. It's invaluable. Thank you for your support of the National Death Penalty Archive, and thank you for sharing your thoughts with us today. This has been a fascinating discussion.
My pleasure. Thank you for asking me.